There's a moment that can happen in a tabletop role-playing game. And if you've been playing long enough, you've probably felt it. It's the moment you realize that no matter how carefully you plan, no matter how much risk you take, no matter how decisively you act, the outcome was already decided. And when that happens, something fundamental breaks. Today I want to talk about that moment. About realism, about agency, about sandbox play, and about something that happens when the dice stop mattering. When the player's actions and decisions stop mattering. Before we dive in, I just want to take a moment to invite you into the conversation. If you're enjoying the kinds of discussions we have here in Midnight's Lair about GMing philosophy, world building, old school play, and what actually makes a role-playing game work at the table, then liking the videos and subscribing really does help the channel more than you might think. And I genuinely love to hear your thoughts. So feel free to leave a comment, whether you agree with me or disagree with me, or have your own take. That conversation is kind of the whole point. And if you want to support the show a little more directly, and I completely understand if you can't, but if you can, and it's worth it to you, you could also join the Midnight's Lair Patreon. For $3 Canadian a month, Patreons get early access to episodes and access to the Midnight's Lair Discord server, a place to talk about RPGs, share ideas, and hang out with other folks who enjoy this style of play and who watch the show. That support helps offset the cost of running the channel and tells me that this kind of long-form, thoughtful RPG content is worth continuing. Now, back to the episode. At their heart, role-playing games make a very specific promise. Not that you'll win, not that things will be fair, not even that the story will go your way. The promise is this: if players think ahead, take risks, and act decisively, the world will respond honestly. That's the deal. When I say honestly, I don't mean kindly. I don't mean morally. I don't even mean in the player's favor. I mean consistent with the genre, tone, and stakes the table has agreed to. Honest consequences can still be brutal. They can still be unfair. And they can still hurt. What they can't be is predetermined. If I wanted a story where outcomes were fixed, I'd probably read a novel. If I wanted perfect balance in my game, I'd play a board game. If I wanted a spectacle with no agency whatsoever, I'd watch a movie. We play role-playing games because cause and effect are effectively real, and because the dice exist to make sure that neither the GM nor the players get to decide everything. And that promise holds, even when the outcome contradicts what the GM expected or planned. There's an old saying, no plan survives contact with the enemy. In tabletop RPGs, that doesn't mean the monsters are the villains. It means the players. It means the players doing things the GM didn't expect, solving problems sideways, forming alliances that weren't planned, taking moral stands instead of tactical ones, or choosing a risky, principled course of action instead of the safe one. That's not a problem to be corrected. That's the game working. The GM's prep is a plan. The player's action is contact with the reality. A good game isn't one where the plan survives intact. It's one where the plan collides with player action and transforms into something better. A GM doesn't lose authority when this happens. The GM loses certainty and gains discovery. The word sandbox gets used a lot. It's worth slowing down and being precise about it. A sandbox campaign is often described as a game where the GM doesn't spoon-feed the adventures to the players, and the players choose their own goals. The world reacts to what the players do, All of that is true, but here's the part we don't always say out loud. A sandbox only works if the sand is allowed to move. Even if it doesn't move far as the players would hope. A sandbox can absolutely have hard walls. Empires don't fall overnight. Institutions resist change, and power protects itself. But when players succeed, something has to shift, even if it's small, even if it's temporary, even if it creates new and worse problems. If the players can dig, but the GM has to smooth everything back into place to preserve the original shape of the world, then you don't have freedom. You have permission to act, but not permission to matter. A sandbox that can't be disturbed isn't a sandbox. It's a display case. This is usually where someone says, but realism. And here's the thing. Realism is not a single objective standard. Most RPGs already reject realism constantly. I mean, for gosh sakes, magic exists. Gods intervene. Paladins and clerics receive divine power, not to mention druids. Oaths, miracles, curses, prophecies, you take your pick. So when someone says, that's unrealistic, what they often mean is, that doesn't fit the version of realism I'm prioritizing, and that's fine, as long as the genre expectations were made clear at the beginning. Heroic fantasy is not the same thing as grim historical simulation. If gods of justice exist, justice has weight. If oaths matter, breaking them has consequences. If paladins walk the world, morality is not just a personal preference, it's a force. Otherwise, paladins aren't champions of virtue. They're just heavily armed optimists. Something that often gets lost when we talk about realism. Tabletop role-playing games are collaborative fiction. And in that fiction, the players are, well, the heroes. That doesn't mean the world is fair, and it doesn't mean the odds aren't stacked, and it doesn't mean the power doesn't resist change. But it does mean that the story is allowed to bend in ways a purely realistic model never would. In a more realistic version of Star Wars, the rebellion should have been crushed. Outnumbered, outgunned, out-resourced. The Empire should have won every time. And yet it didn't. Not because the Empire was incompetent, but because the heroic fiction allows individual courage, improbable success, and decisive action to matter more than raw power. That's not bad writing. It's the genre. If realism always favors empires, then heroism never gets a turn. If a campaign is meant to reject that assumption, it's meant to be a tragedy or a story about inevitability. And then that needs to be explicit. Because most players sit down expecting to play heroes, not historical footnotes. A resistant world is good. A world that pushes back, that makes victory costly, that demands sacrifice. That's great play. But there's a line. And once you cross it, resistance becomes something else. I call it structural futility. Structural futility is not the same thing as consequences. Consequences say, you won, but it cost you. Structural futility says, you won, but it didn't matter. Winning the fight, but losing politically, can be honest play. Winning tactically and triggering retaliation, that can be honest play. What isn't honest is when success is quietly erased to preserve the status quo. Sometimes this isn't railroading. Sometimes it's about protecting the sandbox itself. Not a plot, not a story, but a version of the world that isn't supposed to change too much or too fast. When the world constantly self-corrects, player initiative becomes cosmetic. And once players realize that, something happens. Either they disengage or they escalate. And neither leads to a healthy game. Let's talk about GM fiat, or GMing by decree. GM fiat is not evil. It's not bad design by default. Fiat works when it clarifies ambiguity or resolves undefined situations, or if it preserves pacing. It can also enforce agreed upon genre boundaries. But fiat becomes corrosive when it's used to, well, undo player success, or protect NPCs from earned consequences, or enforce a mandatory outcome after the dice have spoken. Because once a GM decides what must happen, the dice stop being arbiters and become props. This doesn't mean the GM can never protect momentum. It means that if an outcome must happen, a war has to break out, a message must get through, a powerful faction react, the mechanism for that outcome should exist before the dice are rolled. A clock of some type, a contingency plan, a faction, a second messenger, not invented afterward to undo success. The GM sacrificing certainty is not the same thing as sacrificing fun. We often say, the player characters are the heroes of the story. Now, that's not just flavor text. It means the world reacts to them. History bends around their actions, and their choices matter more than anyone else's. If the NPCs always escape when needed, if institutions never crack, if outcomes are protected regardless of player success, then the protagonists aren't the PCs. It's the setting. And the setting doesn't roll dice. Heroes do. Let me be very clear. I'm not saying players should always win, or GM should abandon prep, or that consequences shouldn't exist. What I'm saying is this: if we fail, let us fail. If we succeed, let us succeed. But don't decide in advance which one is allowed. I don't need fairness. I don't need victory. I need honesty. Every table has a social contract, even if it's never spoken out loud or articulated in any way. Sometimes the real problem isn't bad GMing or bad play. It's that the GM is running a story about political inertia or a tragedy, and the players think they're in a heroic transformation story. That mismatch doesn't make anyone wrong, but it does make disappointment inevitable unless it's addressed properly and openly. So at some point, it's worth asking, can the world fundamentally change? Are some outcomes mandatory? Is success allowed or only survival? And if you're running a sandbox, there's one crucial question. Are the players allowed to disrupt the sandbox itself? Because if the answer is no, then exploration is allowed, but transformation is not. I'll leave you with this. A GM doesn't lose control when the players disrupt the plan. They gain a better story than the one they prepared. Because the moments we remember, the ones we talk about years later, are never the ones that went according to plan. They're the ones where the dice fell, the players acted, and the world changed, even when it wasn't supposed to. Well, I think we'll call this one done. Remember to like and subscribe. It helps the channel more than you can imagine. And until next week, when I once again open the doors to Midnight's Lair, be safe. Take care of yourselves and those you love, and do good.